Before we begin, an update. The recording you're about to hear was produced prior to today's news. On Monday, March 23rd, President Trump announced he would extend the 48-hour ultimatum on Iran by 5 days, citing what he called very good and productive conversations with Iranian leaders. When asked who he was negotiating with, the president said he was dealing with a man who I believe is the most respected and the leader. He clarified that this was not the supreme leader regarding Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah, who had assumed the position after his father's assassination. President Trump said, "We have not heard from the son. Every once in a while you will see a statement made, but we do not know if he is living." Now, Iran denied that any negotiations had taken place. Their parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, posted on X, "No negotiations have been held with the U.S., and fake news is used to manipulate the financial and oil markets." Regardless of the current status, whether the ultimatum is 48 hours or 5 days, whether negotiations are occurring or being denied, the content of this episode remains of value. The patterns we examine, the parallels we draw to Vietnam, the mechanisms of deception and consent manufacture, the constitutional questions, these do not expire with today's news cycle. The circumstances will continue to evolve. The analysis endures.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
On Saturday evening, March 22nd, 2026, President Donald Trump posted the following message on Truth Social. If Iran doesn't fully open, without threat, the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. Power plants. Civilian infrastructure. The systems that keep hospitals running, that pump water to homes, that allow a modern society to function. The deadline expires Monday evening. In episode 11, we examined Operation Rolling Thunder, the sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam that lasted from March 1965 to November 1968, 3.5 years. Over 864,000 tons of bombs dropped, more tonnage than the United States had dropped in the entire Pacific theater of World War II. The targets included bridges, roads, railways, and power plants. The objective was to break North Vietnam's will to fight by destroying the infrastructure that sustained its war effort, and by extension, the infrastructure that sustained civilian life. It did not work. North Vietnam did not surrender. The bombing hardened resistance rather than breaking it. And the images of American aircraft destroying civilian infrastructure became a moral stain that contributed to the collapse of domestic support for the war. 60 years later, a president posts a threat to obliterate power plants on social media. The method of announcement has changed. The underlying logic has not. Today we examine the war through the lens of Vietnam, not to predict outcomes, but to recognize patterns. The lies that start wars, the media that manufacture consent, the return to overt infrastructure targeting. And the question that animates this entire series: Did this leave Americans more free or more governed? I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 11, part B of the series Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, the lights go out, from Rolling Thunder to the 48-hour ultimatum. This is a contemporary application episode connecting Saturday's examination of Vietnam to the ongoing war in Iran, now in its fourth week. Let us begin with the lies. Nobody does this better than Scott Horton, so let me just do this a little bit differently and tie this back to the patterns we just discussed in our Vietnam episode. In that episode, episode 11, we examined the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the alleged attack on American destroyers that provided the legal justification for escalating the war in Vietnam. We noted that the second attack on August 4th, 1964, almost certainly did not occur. Captain John Herrick, commander of the Maddox, cabled within hours. Review of action makes many reported contacts and torpedo fired appear doubtful. The Johnson administration knew the evidence was questionable. They proceeded anyway. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed the Senate 88-2. It passed the House 416-0. A war that would kill 58,000 Americans and millions of Vietnamese began with an incident that probably never happened. Now, I mentioned Scott Horton. And Scott Horton is the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and the author of several books on American foreign policy, including Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. He has conducted over 6,000 interviews on these subjects since 2003. And he spoke at the Libertarian Party of Pennsylvania Convention this past weekend. I want to walk through the case he made about the lies that started this war, the war in Iran. The central justification offered for the attack on Iran, as we all know, was the nuclear threat. We were told Iran was 2 weeks away from having a nuclear bomb. This claim was repeated across media platforms in January and February of 2026. Here's what the evidence actually shows. Iran was not making a nuclear bomb. Iran has never made a nuclear bomb. Even the CIA's 2003 National Intelligence Estimate, which claimed Iran had been exploring nuclear weapons until that year, was based on false intelligence. The assessment relied on two things. First, mistaken interpretations of DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, intercepts about dual-use materials that turned out to be used for civilian purposes, as later confirmed by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Second, the so-called smoking laptop, which were documents allegedly smuggled out of Iran in 2004 that purported to show this weapons research. The laptop was a forgery. The CIA has later acknowledged they provided the laptop, and the IAEA has acknowledged that the information was handed to them by the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, an Iranian dissident group acting on behalf of Israeli intelligence. The accusations in the documents turned out to be wrong. They were just best guesses that did not match reality. And both Ayatollah Khomeini and his successor Ayatollah Khamenei issued fatwas, which are religious edicts. They declared weapons of mass destruction to be haram, forbidden under Islamic law. Now, as Scott says, and it's a great line, you don't have to take any politician's word at face value, much less that of a foreign theocrat. But the evidence shows that these edicts were actually followed. Iran did not pursue nuclear weapons, nor chemical or biological weapons. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard confirmed this before the 12-day war, before the attack last June. Iran had not made the political decision to begin trying to make a nuclear weapon. Thus, the overall pretext was false. But here's what makes the deception even more troubling. In the weeks before February 28th, Iran engaged in negotiations with the United States through Omani intermediaries. According to credible reports, including from the Omani foreign minister himself, who announced on February 27th, the day before our attack, he announced a breakthrough had been reached. Iran had agreed to terms far more restrictive than the 2015 JCPOA that Trump had torn up in 2018. The proposed deal included a full moratorium on uranium enrichment for 5 years, and enrichment limited to 1.5% uranium-235 after that period. That's below even the level needed for civilian reactors. Iran would ship its entire uranium stockpile out of the country, not to Russia, but to the United States, to be converted into fuel rods and shipped back for reactor use. And this comes with full IAEA verification. Al-Busadi, the foreign minister of Oman, said peace was within reach. Talks were scheduled to resume on March 2nd. But the attack came on February 28th. Joe Kent, the former Special Forces officer who served as Trump's counterterrorism advisor, director of counterterrorism, and resigned last week over the war, gave an interview to Scott Horton shortly after his resignation. Kent's assessment: they launched the war because negotiations were too fruitful. The pretext for war was being undermined. The pattern is identical to Vietnam. In 1964, the Johnson administration had evidence that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was questionable. They used it anyway because they wanted the war. In 2026, the Trump administration had a diplomatic solution in hand. They attacked anyway. The question is not whether the intelligence was flawed. The question is whether flawed intelligence was embraced because it served the predetermined objective. There's one more element of the pre-war propaganda that deserves examination. In January 2026, you may recall a massive media campaign claiming the Iranian regime had killed between 30,000 and 80,000 innocent protesters during the unrest earlier that month. President Trump cited a figure of more than 30,000 killed by Iranian authorities. 30,000 is an extreme number. That's months of the killings that happened in Gaza. And we've seen the pictures from the devastation in Gaza. So the claim was that the Iranian regime had killed just as many people in weeks. Of course, the actual number, according to evidence available now, was approximately 3,000. And of those, roughly a third were security forces. And many of the remaining deaths involved armed groups attacking police stations and government facilities, and not peaceful protesters. Now, as Scott said, there certainly were some peaceful protesters there, and likely some died as a result of that, and that is horrible. But to claim 30,000 peaceful protesters were killed by a regime is just disingenuous. And it's meant for one purpose: to act as war propaganda. Again, violent armed forces attacking police and police attacking back, causing deaths, is terrible. But it is not peaceful protest. As I said, this is not to defend the Iranian government's response to domestic unrest, but it is to note that the casualty figures were inflated by an order of magnitude. The purpose of that inflation was to create moral outrage sufficient to support military action and, crucially, to convince decision makers that the Iranian regime was so brittle, so hated by its own people, that it would collapse at the first blow. And as Scott Horton put it on Saturday, that means Donald Trump is also a victim of this propaganda. The president was told, hit them and they will fall right over. Every last Iranian is chomping at the bit to overthrow their government. All you have to do is strike. 23 days later, the regime has not fallen. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. 14 American service members are dead. Over 200 are wounded. Iran has struck American bases across 9 countries. And the president is issuing ultimatums to destroy civilian power plants.
I warned against entangling alliances. They did not listen. Now you can trace exactly how it happened.
The Consequential Actions podcast is on YouTube. Subscribe and follow each series from the very beginning. Principled debate requires participation. Like the episodes. Leave a comment. Join the discussion.
Every series is organized as a playlist, from General Welfare to The New Leviathan to Empire of Liberty. Begin at the beginning.
In Vietnam, it was called the credibility gap, the growing divide between what the government claimed was happening and what the American public could observe with their own eyes. Body counts that always showed progress, light at the end of the tunnel that never arrived, metrics of success that somehow never translated into actual success. The Pentagon Papers, leaked by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, revealed the full scope of the deception. The government had systematically lied, not just to the public, but to itself. The internal assessment showed officials knew the war was not being won, even as they publicly claimed otherwise. Today, the mechanisms of consent manufactured have evolved. The credibility gap has been replaced by something more sophisticated: the tautological poll.
Yeah, you know, sometimes you look at the polling data and there are numbers that just jump off the screen at you, and this is one of those. Because just take a look here. MAGA GOP view of Trump. Approve 100%. 100%. If you are a member of MAGA and the GOP, you approve of Donald John Trump. 0% say that they disapprove. You don't have to be a mathematical genius to know you can't go higher than 100%. He is the 1972 Miami Dolphins.
100%? The 1972 Miami Dolphins of approval ratings. The White House loved this clip so much that the press secretary shared it directly. President Trump repeated the number to reporters. Let us examine what this statistic actually means. MAGA Republican is a self-identified category. It is not a demographic. It is not a geographic region. It is a label that individuals choose to apply themselves based on their support for the president and his agenda. By definition, anyone who disapproves of the president stops identifying as MAGA. The moment you express disapproval, you are no longer counted in this category. The 100% figure is not a measuring support, is a measuring the tautology of self-selection. The analyst G. Elliott Morris, writing in his Substack, Strength in Numbers, called this misleading tautology that hides the real erosion happening in Trump's coalition. The actual polling tells a different story. In the March 13th to 16 Economist YouGov poll, 87% of MAGA supporters approved of Trump's handling of Iran. 78% approved of the war. Those are high numbers, but even those are not 100%. And when you ask about specific policies, the numbers drop further. Only 35% favored sending ground troops. Only 30% said the United States should try to end the war quickly. Among non-MAGA Republicans, who make up nearly half of the party according to the same polling, support for the war drops to 48%, with 40% opposed. On the question of $50 billion in additional war funding, non-MAGA Republicans split 43-42. A Quincy Institute poll found that 79% of Trump voters would support him declaring victory and ending the war quickly. Among Trump voters ages 18 to 29, support for the war was just 8 points net positive, compared to 53 points overall. None of these numbers appeared in the CNN segment. The 100% figure went viral. The nuance did not. This is how consent is manufactured in the modern era. Not through direct falsehood. The 100% figure is technically accurate within its circular definition, but through the presentation of data designed to be shareable rather than informative. The framing matters because it shapes the narrative about what is politically possible. If you believe 100% of the president's base supports the war, you conclude that opposition is futile. If you know that nearly a quarter of his 2024 voters disapprove of his handling of Iran, you reach a much different conclusion. In episode 10B, we examined the legacy of Operation Mockingbird, the CIA program that placed assets in media organizations during the Cold War. We noted the Sinclair Broadcasting compilation of local anchors reading identical scripts. We examined the coordination between Senator Lindsey Graham, retired General Jack Keane, and columnist Mark Thiessen to influence the president toward war with Iran. That coordination has continued. The Wall Street Journal reported that Graham worked with Keane and Thiessen to take turns calling the president, write op-eds, and make television appearances. Graham visited Israel for intelligence briefings, telling reporters, "They will tell me things our own government will not tell me." A United States senator traveled to a foreign country to receive intelligence that he then used to lobby the president for war, intelligence that American agencies would not provide because they did not support the same conclusions. We've also observed the recycling of talking points across contexts. In 2025, when the administration imposed tariffs, we heard short-term pain for long-term gain. We heard this repeated across networks and platforms, the same phrase, the same framing from different mouths. And in 2026, the same construction appeared in defense of the Iran war, short-term pain for long-term gain. The consistency suggests coordination. The Vietnam-era credibility gap emerged because the public could eventually compare government claims to observable reality. The Tet Offensive shattered the illusion of progress because Americans watched their embassy under siege on television. Today, the question is whether observable reality can penetrate the information environment at all. When polls are designed to produce predetermined conclusions, and when talking points are coordinated across platforms, when the shareable headline contradicts the underlying data, the credibility gap becomes harder to perceive. Let us return to the 48-hour ultimatum. If Iran doesn't fully open without threat the Straits of Hormuz within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, striking the biggest one first. That's not subtle. That's not ambiguous. The President of the United States publicly threatened to destroy civilian power infrastructure unless the foreign government complied with his demands within 2 days. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was asked directly on CBS Face the Nation whether targeting energy infrastructure would constitute a war crime. His response did not address the question. Instead, he pointed to Iran's own human rights record, a deflection rather than an answer. Under the Geneva Conventions, attacks on Objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population are prohibited. International humanitarian law requires that collateral civilian harm from strikes not be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. Power plants supply hospitals. They run water treatment facilities. They keep food refrigerated. They keep medicine refrigerated. In a country of 88 million people, destroying the electrical grid is not a precision strike against a military capability. It is an attack on the systems that sustain civilian life. The Iranian opposition figure, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah, no friend of the current regime, called on Trump and Netanyahu to target the military while sparing civilian infrastructure, which Iranians will need to rebuild our country. Even those who want regime change in Iran recognize that destroying power plants is not liberation. It's collective punishment. In episode 11, we examined Operation Rolling Thunder in detail. The bombing campaign against North Vietnam was justified on similar grounds, degrading the enemy's ability to wage war by destroying the infrastructure that supported it. The targets included power plants, transportation networks, industrial facilities, fuel storage, communications infrastructure. The theory was wrong. North Vietnam absorbed the punishment. The infrastructure was rebuilt, often with Soviet and Chinese assistance. The bombing did not break the will to fight, it hardened it. And the images of American aircraft destroying bridges, villages, and power facilities became a moral burden that eroded domestic support for the war. In 1968, when the Tet Offensive shattered the illusion of progress, the credibility of the entire enterprise collapsed. President Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The bombing paused. Negotiations began. But the war continued for 7 more years. There's an important distinction to acknowledge here, and I want to be precise about it. The United States did not cease attacking civilian infrastructure after Vietnam. In Iraq in 1991, coalition forces deliberately targeted electrical generation, water treatment, and sewage systems. A DIA document from January 1991, later declassified, analyzed the effects of destroying Iraq's water treatment capability, predicting increased disease and civilian mortality. In Iraq in 2003, the Shock and Awe campaign, it targeted government infrastructure, communications, and power systems. In Libya in 2011, NATO strikes degraded the country's infrastructure as part of the regime change operation. What's different about the current moment is not the targeting of civilian infrastructure. What is different is the public, explicit social media announcement of intent to do so as a threat, as an ultimatum, as a negotiation tactic broadcast to the world. In previous conflicts, the destruction of infrastructure was acknowledged after the fact, if even acknowledged at all. Civilian harm was described as collateral damage. Oh, I hate that term. It was an unintended consequence, a regrettable necessity, as if understanding that degrading infrastructure is unintended, when no, that is exactly the intention. But the government maintained at least the pretense that it was not deliberately targeting civilian welfare. The 48-hour ultimatum abandons that pretense entirely. We will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. And by the way, the biggest one is a nuclear power plant. This is not collateral damage. This is announced intent. The mask, the veneer, has dropped. In the hours since, the Iranian regime has responded to the ultimatum with threats of its own. If Iranian power plants are attacked, Iran has declared it will target energy infrastructure throughout the Persian Gulf region, desalination facilities that provide drinking water to Israel and Gulf states, communications infrastructure, and in an unusual escalation, the Speaker of Iran's parliament threatened that entities that finance the U.S. military budget are legitimate targets, warning that the U.S. Treasury bond buyers could face retaliation. The International Energy Agency has warned that the current crisis is worse than the oil shocks of the 1970s. Brent crude has risen above $114 per barrel. Goldman Sachs projects elevated prices through 2027. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil passes, remains effectively closed. Iran has stated it will close the strait completely and indefinitely if its power plants are struck. The escalation spiral is now clearly visible. The United States threatens infrastructure, Iran threatens infrastructure. Each side raises the stakes. The theory of deterrence assumes rational actors will recognize the mutual cost and step back. But deterrence theory also assumes that the decision makers have accurate information about the other side's capabilities and intentions. Assumptions we have already seen are questionable. Throughout this series, we have returned to a single evaluative question. Did this leave Americans more free or more governed? Let us apply that question to the current moment. The war in Iran was launched without a declaration of war by Congress. It was launched during active negotiations when a diplomatic solution was within reach. It was justified by intelligence claims that appear to have been exaggerated or totally fabricated. The Constitution grants Congress the power to declare war. That power has not been exercised. War power votes in both the House and Senate failed to pass. The executive branch proceeded regardless. Americans are now paying higher gas prices, approximately $1 more than when the war began. American service members are dying. 14 confirmed as of this recording, and American bases across the Middle East have been struck. And the president is now publicly threatening to destroy the civilian infrastructure in a country of 88 million people. In episode 10B, we asked, who guards the guardians? We examined the failure of oversight mechanisms created after the Church Committee. We noted that no comparable investigation has been conducted in 50 years. The same pattern continues here. When the congressional votes to invoke the war powers failed, 47 to 53 in the Senate and 212 to 219 in the House, the administration continued. There was no mechanism to compel a different outcome. The constitutional requirement for congressional authorization has become, in practice, advisory. The Americans who lived through Vietnam learned something that subsequent generations were encouraged to forget. They learned that governments lie to start wars. They learned that military solutions to political problems tend to fail. They learned that the cost in lives, treasure, morality always exceed the projections. And they learned that the light at the end of the tunnel is often an oncoming train. This knowledge was labeled Vietnam Syndrome, treated as a disease to be cured rather than wisdom to be preserved. As we noted in that episode, the actual lessons of Vietnam were invoked to justify subsequent wars while the real lessons were ignored. And here we go again. A war launched on questionable intelligence, a media environment that manufactures consent, infrastructure targeting announced as policy, and a constitutional structure that has proven incapable of constraining executive war making. I do not know how this war ends. I do not know whether the president will follow through on his ultimatum or find a way to declare victory and withdraw. I do not know whether Iran will escalate further or seek negotiation. I do not know whether the constitutional mechanisms that have failed to constrain this war will somehow, some way, reassert themselves. What I do know is that the patterns we have examined in this series, the patterns established in Vietnam, repeated in Iraq, repeated in Afghanistan, repeated in Libya, are repeating again. The lies, the manufactured consent, the infrastructure targeting, the constitutional bypass, the assumption that this time will be different. Scott Horton closed his remarks at the Pennsylvania Convention with a call to support the Defend the Guard movement, state-level legislation that would prohibit National Guard deployment to overseas combat without a congressional declaration of war. It's a very important movement, and I support it wholeheartedly. It's one of the few mechanisms that might restore the constitutional balance that has been abandoned. Whether it succeeds or fails, the effort represents something important: the recognition that existing structures have not worked, and that citizens must build new ones. On Saturday, episode 12, we'll begin part 5 of our series with Charlie Wilson's Blowback, examining how American support for the Afghan Mujahideen created the networks, weapons, and ideology that attacked America on September 11, 2001. The through line continues. Consequences that span decades, blowback that arrives long after the original decisions are forgotten. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 11, part B of the Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.